Hey everyone, this is Bathmetrics, and in today's video I'm going to take you through a fast-moving guided tour of a whole bunch of hacks and secrets about the new Vital synth. We're going to start with the master output and oscillator levels and talk about how Vital does its gain staging and whether or not it does limiting or clipping on the output. So by default, the level is for any given oscillator is set at -6 dB. And the master output's default value is also -6 dB. This little white line represents 0 dB. So if we just put in a basic shape at full amplitude and play, you can see down here in the level meter of my DAW that the signal coming out is -12 dB. So if we push the level all the way up to full, we now have a -6 dB signal because this is still 6 dB below 0. And if we pop this up to exactly 0, the meter turns red. We're hitting exactly 0 dB, but this is the part that we need to talk about. This is very counterintuitive at first. If you look at the little oscilloscope, the mini oscilloscope up here in the upper left, it looks like this signal might be starting to clip. And this red bar looks scary, like, oh, something bad is happening. I must be clipping. But it's a little misleading. If you look at the oscilloscope down here, Vital is not actually clipping. It will not clip until 6.4 dB over 0. So let's show that. The way we can show that is by going to the effects section. We're going to turn on a compressor that I've set up to be single band with no compression at all. And we'll circle back to this later because this compressor is very cool, but not always obvious at first. So anyway, right now, it's not doing anything. It's completely neutral. If I push this middle band value up, we can go above this 0 dB line. I could also go above 0 dB by pushing the master further up, but I just kind of want to show you with the master output set at 0 dB. Okay, so if we push the band up just a little bit, let's push it up about a dB. 1.1 dB over 0. We can see we're here at 1.1, 1.2. Still no visible clipping on the waveform. Let's push this up a little higher. Let's go up to about 3 dB, right? Still no clipping. We're 3 dB over 0. No clipping at all on this sine wave. Although this meter up here makes it look like there's a huge amount of clipping. So this is my first tip number one. Kind of ignore this meter when it comes to levels and don't worry about being in the red. That doesn't much matter either until you get way over red. So where we start seeing clipping, if I push this up even further towards 6 dB, so I'm right here at just over 6 dB. We still don't see any clipping. We're at 6.1 dB on the meter. This looks clipped as heck, but again, don't count on this. Just know that up to 6.4 dB, you have no clipping. We can verify that by looking at something like Oscilloscope Pro. We'll stop playback for a second. We'll zoom in really close on one of these waveforms, and you can see there's no clipping whatsoever. All right, let's keep going. Drop this down again. Play this some more. Gonna slowly creep up to just under 6.4. Let's try 6.36 dB. Let's reset that. Again, you don't see any obvious clipping here. If we go to Oscilloscope Pro, you don't see any obvious clipping on the waveform yet. Now, the minute I go over 6.4 dB, we'll go up to 6.5, for example. You'll notice this meter's staying pinned at 6.4. You can't really see the clipping here because the resolution of this oscilloscope, but if we go to Oscilloscope Pro, and especially if we pause it and look closely, you'll see that squared off clipping. And it is, in fact, simple, hard clipping. Let's clip it even further to see what that looks like. Just going to push this way up into about that far, right? So again, if we look at Oscilloscope, you can see it's clearly just plain, simple, hard clipping. So that's my first tip. Don't worry about the red. Don't worry about this meter. Just know that you can push the combination of your summed oscillators and all the other stuff you're doing and all the effects. And the master output, you can go all the way up to 6.4 dB over 0, and you're not clipping. So that leads to a rule of thumb about where to set your track volume. If you set your track volume to negative 6.4 on your track fader, that means you can run Vital full steam, full tilt, in the red, crank things up, just work by ear, and you can be confident that if your fader on the track that Vital's sitting on, if your fader is set to negative 6.4, no matter what you're doing inside of Vital and how big and fat and clipped that waveform might be inside of Vital, it will not be clipping above 0 on your track in the DAW. And so, you know, if you like to work in a sort of clip to 0 paradigm, this is one way to do that. Okay, let's move on to the next stuff. The upper mini oscilloscope is very cool, but not everyone knows right away that you can just left click it one time and now you see a spectrum analyzer. And of course, this is a simple sine wave, so it's not that exciting, but let's pick a different shape. And so you can see the spectrum analyzer with the harmonics. It's the same exact meter you see here in the advanced tab. Moving on to the next thing, set that back to an oscilloscope. Let's just go back to our simple sine, stop playback. Okay, browser. I have a whole other video that I've done on browsers. Check my playlist of producer tutorials. I put out one on launch day that gives you some tips for how to reorganize your browser. But the hack and tip I want to talk about here has to do with this section right here where you do filtering for your different banks. Okay, so all of these things you see here are the different Vital banks that come in, well, some of them come in the Pro version of Vital, and then this one from Black Lotus Audio is a third-party free pack that I installed, but everything else here is default Vital packs. I have my own Vital bank in here, and I have a bank full of stuff from Beta. Now, here's the thing. If you click one of these to focus on, say, just the presets for the factory bank, and there aren't that many in just the raw factory bank, right? The minute you do this, the minute you use this as a filter, you can go to other folders, right? But you're always filtered from this point on. And so you're never actually seeing the full possible set of all presets up here. And so your searches or, you know, clicking for show me bass patches, they're always going to be filtered and constrained to showing you only the results of whatever bank you've picked here. And I'm sure at some point Matt will add a simple way here to clear this filter. But for now, a workaround, a very simple workaround, is just minimize the window. You don't have to close Vital. You don't have to take it out of your DAW. You just minimize the window and then reopen it. And then if you come back into the browser, this set of filters have been cleared. So if you go poking around and digging around and say, you know, I want to see what Billion has, okay, that's the stuff in their Pro Pack 1. Here's Kirumi. Here's the things that were in her Pro Pack 1. You do that. You bop around in here, you're all filtered, and you want to clear these filters so that you can use search or this and just search through all your presets. Just minimize, reopen, and those filters are cleared. And this is true for any of the browsers, including the wavetable browser, including the LFO browser, and including the sample browser here. Okay, you can, if you've clicked any of these folder filters or bank filters, you can clear it by just minimizing Vital and reopening the Vital window again. All right, let's see. Another useful trick is, let's say you're popping around. Actually, I'm going to do this with the wavetables. If I go into the wavetable browser and let's say I go to the factory, right? I notice when I'm looking at, where is it? I'm trying to find some dupes. Oh, I know. Let's close this and reopen it to clear all those filters. And again, this is just a temporary workaround. I'm sure Matt will make this nicer later. So let's say I'm in my wavetable browser and I go, I'm looking for basic shapes. And I start typing basic in the search bar here. And you'll notice I've got some duplicates, like there's a basic shapes, there's a basic shapes, there's another basic shapes. Which one of these is the basic shapes, right? I might have duplicates because I've had a bunch of folders hanging around since beta, and I may have some duplicate copies of some of these wavetables that I haven't found and cleaned out the duplicates yet, right? So when you come across something like this, if you ever want to go see where a wavetable or sample or LFO shape or preset is coming from in your Vital folder, you can right-click any one of these and say Open File Location, and that will bring up a browser window right to the place that comes from. Like this basic shapes is actually from a folder that I've mapped in. You can do this add folder thing. I actually grabbed my analog wavetables folder from Serum. So we can see, oh, that's the basic shapes from Serum. Okay, so we can ignore that one. What's this one? Open file location. Well, this is the one from the factory wavetables and the basic folder. And so this is the main basic shapes, right? So what's this one? Well, let's close it and open file location. And I can see, okay, this is something that was junk that I kept around from beta. So I don't need this anymore, right? This was probably one I made for myself during beta because we didn't have a basic shapes very early in beta. So since we now have a good basic shapes table, I'm just going to delete this. And this brings me to my next tip, which is you can do live reorganization and updating and renaming of all of your folders and banks and individual files. I just deleted a file live while this was open, right? Other synths will freak out if you do that. But with Vital, notice I have this basic shapes here, and I deleted that. I just deleted the actual version of that. If we close the browser down and reopen it, so we're back and everything's been cleared and reset, and I come over here and I search for basic, you'll notice that entry is no longer there. So you can do your cleanup and your reorganization and your renaming and rename your banks and do all that kind of stuff. And anytime you want to reset it and double check your changes, just minimize the window, bring it open again, and you'll see all those latest changes reflected. Which brings me to another tip, which is if you want to float certain Vital banks to the top of the list, like this could get really long once many Vital banks have come out, but I always want to see my bank with my presets in it here at the top. And I always want to see, like I have a whole bunch of stuff I collected during beta, so I want to see all my beta stuff here right at the top and be able to like jump into the beta folder and see, you know, individual people who have submitted things during beta, including miscellaneous people, right? So this is just my personal collection of stuff. And I want these folders always at the top. So a trick for that is just use a little alphanumeric kind of character, like an underscore or whatever, and that will float it to the top alphabetically. So that's another little hack for you. This is a good one. So let's say I take a shape and I do something crazy to it. I'll show you more about this wavetable editor later, but let's say I want to draw in some serum style noise at a couple spots in this simple sine wave. And I want to save this as a new wavetable. So I do save as, puts my author name there automatically. Let's just say delete me test, right? And if I save it, it doesn't ask me where I want to save it. So this is something that will confuse people at first. By default, when you save anything, a preset, a wavetable, an LFO shape, it's always going to put it in a Vital bank called user by default. So if I go here to this user bank, here's the shape I just made, right? So I don't really like that. I like my stuff being up at the top. So once you've made something like this particular wavetable. You can right click on it, say open file location, and then you can cut it. You can go find the folder you really want to put it in, like in my case, bathymetrics wavetables. And now I can paste it into here. And now I've moved it from that user folder over here, right? So now if we minimize the vital window and reopen the vital window, and I go to the wavetables, now here's the wavetable in the right folder, and the user folder is now empty. So again, this pattern works across vital, whether we're talking about wavetables or presets or LFO shapes or whatever. If you save it, it's always going to go in user. If you want to put it somewhere other than user, go find it and move it outside in the file system, and then just minimize, reopen, and then it'll be where you decided you wanted to put it. Okay, and I think that's, well, there is one other thing. Vital banks may confuse people. You may occasionally purchase something, or a friend will share with you something called a vital bank. And these two options on the hamburger menu let you load or create vital banks. Importing will load a vital bank in. So what a vital bank looks like is, I'll find it. Where are you? There we go. So this is a vital bank. And one thing to know about them is they're just zip files with a different name. If you right click this and open this in some utility that lets you see inside of a zip file, you can see that this is the vital bank, and it's just a regular zip folder. And so you can peek around in here and see what the structure and content of a vital bank is going to be before you actually import it into the vital folder. So, you know, if I wanted to import this, I would just do vital import bank, go find it. So in this case, it's in my downloads folder. And here's the vital bank, right? It's looking for things called vital bank. So if I selected this and clicked open, it would load the vital bank. Now I've already done that. And this is the folder that it created. And here's all of the presets in the bank. And there's other, I think there's some wavetables in the bank too. I can't remember. Then I renamed it a little bit so that it was just a shorter name up here. And inside you can see there's the subfolder that was actually in the zip file that I drilled through. So in case I ever purchase any more packs from Black Lotus Audio, I'll just load the vital bank in, and maybe I'll take the subfolder out of whatever bank got loaded and just drag it in under the Black Lotus Audio top level bank that I already have in my vital structure, right? So here's the vital folder. Here's the Black Lotus Audio top level bank presets, and then here's that one vital pack, right? So again, go watch my other video that talked about browser organization to learn a little more about the ways you can reorganize the browser. And that's pretty much it for tips about using extra tips that I didn't cover in the other video for the browser. Now let's talk about parameters in general and parameter entry. It may not be obvious at first. When you first drag parameters around, they jump in pretty big increments, but you can hold control while you're dragging to move in much finer increments. Okay, so that's one tip. You can alt-click a parameter, hold down Alt and left-click it, and now you can enter a value like 50%, so it's halfway here. Or if I had a filter open, you know, and I wanted to enter a specific hertz value, I could say 400 hertz. And now it'll jump up there, right? So Alt-Enter is how you specifically set values. You can double-click to reset any kind of parameter to its default. Like if I move it way up here and then double-click it, it goes back to its default position. And that's true of anything like the level knob here. If I double-click it, or if I crank the master all the way to full and double-click it, it'll go back to its default of -6. And every control in here, double-click to reset. And then another tip that people overlook at first. I've seen a lot of people setting their oscillator pitch one semitone at a time. But if you hold shift, when you drag anything that has to do with a coarse pitch, semitones, if I hold shift and drag up and down, it just jumps in whole octaves, plus or minus. And the same is true if you are in an oscillator and set it to a key tracked mode so that it does audio rate modulation. By default, it's audio rate at 1 octave below whatever note or frequency you're actually running. But you can hold shift and kick it up to the same as the note, or 2 octaves above the note, or 3 octaves below the note, and so on. So that's a useful trick. All right, oscillators. So unison can be a little tricky at first. There's this thing in the center that looks kind of like Serum's visual depiction of voices, and you can see that by the time you get up to 4 voices or more, there's a little bit of an obvious spread. There's 2 voices that are wider out to the sides than these 3 inner voices. Now, what's not obvious is as soon as you hit 4 voices or more, it won't work with 3 voices or less, but as soon as you're at 4 voices or higher, you can actually click and drag this section to spread those central bars wider or more in towards the center. So it's kind of like in Serum where the center bars go higher and the outer bars go lower to give more weight or volume to the voices closer to center. It's kind of the same idea, right? Only here it's really kind of about the spread of the voices. So again, if I go much higher in the voices, we can spread them further out, spread them further in. And of course, if we detune it to make it even wider, right, you can see this even more, more obviously. And we'll double click to reset, double click to reset. Now we're back to where we were. Okay, let's see. Oh, this is really good. So you probably figured out that, let's reload basic shapes again. Get rid of my little hand-drawn jaggies. There's a 2-dimensional table view and a 3-dimensional table view, just like Serum. And as you run the index back and forth, you see that. But if you click this, you probably notice this SP view. What is this doing? Okay, this means spectral, and it's not really, it's kind of sort of like a spectrum analyzer, but also kind of sort of not. This really represents the full set of frequency bins in the waveform. Clear this out. We'll come back to the wavetable editor a little later and show you some tips here, but basically I've got only one FFT bin in this basic sine wave shape, right? Maybe if I add another couple FFT bins, we'll get a slightly more complex shape. And if we come back here to this, you'll notice this is kind of, these big blobs represent where do you have your FFT bins in the waveform. Where do you have the harmonics of the fundamental? This is always the fundamental. Everything else is harmonics. That's the way FFT wavetable editors work. So this shows you what's going on with the FFT harmonics, the additionals, the partials. Now, where this is really useful, let's go back to basic shapes again and get back to our basic sine wave. This is really meant to show you what's happening with the spectral warping modes. These are all special. This is unique to Vital. I don't know if any other wavetable synth really does spectral warping, but the way it works is it actually creates harmonics and then does warping things with those harmonics. Okay, this isn't a very interesting shape. Let's pick a different, like a square wave or something, right? So as we do vocoding, it's creating additional harmonics in a vocoder-like way, and then it's moving them around like filters in a vocode style filters would do, right? And you can actually see that behavior here. Let's pick a different thing like the format scale, right? You can see it kind of moving the peaks around in a formanty sort of way. Or if we do harmonic stretch, it's going to take, an initial few early harmonics and then start stretching them out further and further and further down the spectrum, and so on and so forth. So that's what this is really useful for, is understanding what these spectral warp modes are doing. You can watch this display and get a feel for, what exactly does random amplitudes do, right? We started out with this, what is this? Square wave? It's triangle. So we have a triangle wave here, and this is without any special phase warping. I'm sorry, spectral warping. Phase warping is this side. But as I mess with this, you can see it's just picking random FFTs all over, the harmonic series, and it's just emphasizing them, de-emphasizing the original fundamental over here, right? So you can see what it's doing, and it's all on the harmonics. This doesn't really affect necessarily the fundamental waveform. This is just what's happening to the harmonics. So anyway, that's enough about this. Something to explore and play with on your own. Okay, let's talk about filters now. The first thing about filters is you're going to see this drive knob and you're going to think, oh, it works like serum. If I want to make this whole patch louder, I just turn up the filter drive, okay? But it doesn't work that way in Vital. It is driving the filter and it is creating additional harmonics from driving the filter, but it's also gain compensated or loudness compensated. So as you drive the harmonics up, it doesn't get any louder, right? In fact, if you really overdrive the harmonics, depending on what the filter looks like, it may actually make the waveform sound quieter because you're creating all these harmonics and spreading things out across the spectrum, and that could make certain things sound quieter than before. So just be aware that drive is not also a secondary level gain control like it is in serum. It's strictly harmonics. If you want to make something louder than you get out of the summed oscillators themselves, you pretty much have to do that in the effects section with either pumping up these various, depending on what mode you're in, right? Pumping up these various output levels for the compressor. That's one way to do it. Another way to get the volume a little louder is using distortion and just driving whatever distortion type or clipping type you're going to use, okay? So those are the two ways to make it louder. But again, don't be afraid to play with this thing. Crank it all the way over here, right? Work in the red. Being in the red is okay. That's why I spent a lot of time earlier on explaining how the gain staging worked and how you can be way in the red and you are not clipping at all. So you can get plenty loud, just don't be afraid to go in the red here. Let's see, what else about filters? Okay, filter values by default are expressed in hertz, and the same is true for things like EQ filters, right? If we take the cutoff and move it around, it's expressed in hertz. But there is an option over here in the Advanced tab. It isn't obvious that you can left-click this and choose semitones right here under the display. And what this does is it makes your cutoff values now appear in terms of semitones. And the center point for semitones is, well, it kind of depends. In the EQ, it's based on effectively like all the way to the left, right? But in the filters, let's just go back to filters. In the filters, the center point, if I double click to put it back at its default position, the default position for the peak of most of the filter types is 261 hertz, which I think is middle C. Yeah, it's middle C. So 0 semitones is middle C, and then as you go up exactly 1 semitone, now you're at C sharp, and then 2 semitones would be D, and so on and so forth in this direction, and then you can go negative below middle C. Okay, so you have this option too. Let's change that back before I continue. I prefer looking at hertz because I'm just used to that. All right, let's talk about modulators now over here. We've got envelope modulators, LFOs, and randoms, and then this weird set over here. And I'm going to spend a little time explaining what these are because most of these are very counterintuitive. First of all, for the modulators itself, by default, you're going to snap when you get near a grid point, right? And let's set this back to something like seconds. And let's set this grid to have some Y values. So you can see as I get close to something, it will, well, actually the bend signals don't snap, but these will, right? Like snaps to that line, snaps to that corner point, snaps to that corner point, snaps up there. Okay, so sometimes that's annoying. If you want to turn off the snap and free range, you just hold Alt. And now I can very precisely position this around a grid point without actually snapping to it. Okay, so hold Alt to disable snapping. Next thing that's really useful to know about the modulators, let's just go back to a simple triangle. Oops. All right. Factory triangle. Okay. When you are assigning modulators in Serum, you pretty much have to drop it on something and then modify it. And the same is true in Phase Plant, which has a similar kind of modulation style. You can get rid of a modulator by just double clicking it. But it's super fast to work with modulators in Vital because there's a little secret. If you keep holding your mouse button down while you hold it over something, you can use your scroll wheel and actually be like, running notes through this and listening in real time while you test and adjust the amount of modulation. And I'm still holding the mouse wheel down, right? You could go, well, I don't really like the way this modulation sounds on this warping mode. So I'm still holding my mouse down and I can just pick it up and say, let's see what it sounds like on the pan. And now I can scroll wheel on the pan. Oh, no, I don't like that. Let's try it on the level and I can scroll wheel on the level. Oh, let's try the octaves and I can scroll wheel the octaves. And you notice as soon as I pull it away, everything goes back to where it was, right? So you've got this live preview of the modulation types. And then the other thing to know is if you hold down any one of your modifier keys, so on a PC, Shift or Control or Alt, it snaps it to bipolar mode. And now I can scroll wheel up and down and preview what this is going to do in bipolar mode. And I go, no, I don't like it there. Let's try it on the wavetable. Let's try bipolar mode on the wavetable. So you can see I'm actually setting a bipolar range there instead of a unipolar range, and so on and so forth. So you can just try it wherever you want. And when you finally find something that sounds good, like let's say we want bipolar on the decay by about this amount, then you can let go and now it's locked in. And now you're actually getting that behavior on the decay knob, and you can further modify it from there or from here, right? And again, if you want to clear it off, just double click it. Okay, let's see what else. Most people don't know that there's this smoothing value on the LFO types. And so, for example, if we had a really rampy sudden jump like this, you could smooth out sudden vertical jumps like this. But if you left click the smooth label, you also get an option to do fade in, which again, it's not going to visually change the shape of the waveform, but it will create a fade effect, which is a little different from smooth. So you could create this sort of attack fade in, like an ADSR attack. So that's pretty cool, and not many people realize that exists. What else? Okay, let's talk about these oscillators. Some of these, like pressure and slide, are MPE related values. So if you have, where is MPE? Right here, MPE enabled. If you click this, like if you have an MPE keyboard, like a Seaboard Rolly or something, right? If you click this so it turns purple, you're enabling Vital to understand MPE signals like pressure and slide. And so if MPE is enabled, these two modulators will modulate according to the pressure and slide values from your special MPE enabled keyboard. velocity is obvious, note is obvious. Lift is reverse velocity. Some keyboards will actually send out a negative or lifting value for when you pull your finger off the key, and that's what this is. Not every keyboard has this. Now, the ones that are unique to Vital and very different from these sort of controller-related modulators, there's this one called octave note, and this one's trippy. This applies 12 increasing value jumps based on the semitones between C and B. So this is easiest to describe if I go to voice. Let's go back to a simple sine wave. So this isn't too noisy. No, let's do a saw wave. Let's turn off the filter. Let's give you a little bit of volume on the master, just a little bit. Don't want to drive you crazy. And let's start this running. Let me turn that down a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to take this octave note and assign it to the pan. This is the easiest way to figure out how it works. So I've got a unipolar modulation from center over to the right. Okay. Now watch what happens as I play different notes on my keyboard controller from C to B. Let me get this monitoring my controller input. So here's the C, and it's right in the center. Now I'm going to go to D. And that last note was B, and you could see B was panned way over to the right, to the extreme of right. And if I keep going past that B to the next C upward, it goes back to center again. So see, it's all based on this. And so if we flip this to a bipolar mode and spread it around the center, now it'll sound like this from C to C. So the first C is way over on the left because it's bipolar now. That's pretty much in the center. And then when I get up to the final C, it goes back over to the start again. So it's a weird one. It might be useful for certain types of modulation, but that's what it does. We'll double click to get rid of it. Stereo is pretty basic and simple. You can assign it to anything and make a stereo offset between the left and right channels. So if I play a C now, it's kind of doing an offset thing, and it's not so fancy or good sounding in a unipolar mode, but let's switch it to bipolar. And now, what else would I have to do? I'd have to make some changes to the shape. It's kind of spreading out my phantom center in this particular case, but if I apply it to other things, it'll be a bit more interesting. So that's a way to widen out your center. Let's apply it to this instead. Now we'll create a little bit of a stereo offset. But see, it's fixed. It's not modulating, it's just a fixed offset. Let's go back to the basic. Actually, I need to have some sort of complex shape for this. And let's jump the modulation up. Right, so a little bit of stereo offset does something interesting here. So the point is, this isn't a moving stereo offset, it's a fixed stereo offset. And you'll find places where that's useful. Most of the time, you're going to get your stereo out of the movement of the oscillators themselves on any given LFO on something like, you know, that's a lot more interesting type of stereo, right? Anyway, let's move on to the next one. Finally, this random one. The random one's cool. This is triggered by every note on message. So every time you hit a new note and a note on, a gate on is triggered, it's going to spit out a random value between 0 and 1. So for example, if I drop it over here and modulate it fully, every time I hit a note, Every time I hit a note, it's just a different random seed. So it's kind of like the sample and hold down here. It's a steppy random seed, but it's not based on time or tempo or syncing with the DAW or audio rate modulation or anything like that. It's just a single new random seed every time you hit a new note. So that's what this one's about. Okay, let's move on to the mod matrix. So let's assign an LFO modulation to something. Let's just modulate the wavetable index here. Maybe move it up a little bit. Okay, so if we go over to the mod matrix, this is very much like Serum. If you're familiar with Serum, the few hidden tips and tricks here are, if you click the number of the lane, you actually mute it. And now there's no more modulation. Even though you see the modulator going, you don't hear it. Click it again, and now you hear the modulation. So this is a mute. The morphing knob is like a simple basic wave shaping. And again, you can double click to recenter it. This down here is a much more complex reshaping, and for really understanding the mod remap and tips and tricks and crazy games you can play with this, I recommend you look at this video by Data Broth, who's also one of the longtime beta testers. This video will blow your mind. Go find it, go watch it, and you will learn all the ins and outs, or quite a few of them anyway, about using mod remap to do crazy stuff. Like you can do additive synthesis inside of Vital by using this. Yeah, really. Go check out that video. But the other two things I want to show you here is that you can take any sort of modulator and assign it to the morph, and then you get this morph value modulating. You can also assign it to the amount, of course, just like Serum. And then you can get interesting stuff that way. Let's see. Yep, that's about all I want to show you there. Now, let's look at the FX section. Really, the only thing in the FX section that might be unusual to some of you if you're not used to OTT from Serum or Ableton or things like that. Let me actually reinitialize this preset. Get rid of that. All right, so here's the default compressor, and by default it's in multi-band mode, and for those of you familiar with OTT, it's set up almost exactly like OTT defaults. So right out of the gate, it's doing OTT's trick, which is really increasing the presence of the highs, really adding a lot of high edge, and also squeezing the waveform's dynamic range down quite a bit. So for certain types of mid-bass sounds especially, that's a very pleasant effect you hear all over in electronic music. But let's talk about how this works for people that aren't familiar with it or are trying to translate what they know about OTT to this. The original multiband dynamics in Ableton, and also in Bitwig, and also in kilohertz to some degree, most of them support 4 types of compression and expansion: upward compression, downward compression, upward expansion, and downward expansion. So that's 4 different ways you're changing the dynamics of the waveform. This particular compressor only supports downward compression with the top bars, and upward compression or downward expansion with the bottom bars. So how does this work? The one thing you might not realize at first is you can drag inside the green area and these bars spread out. This is kind of like how it works in Ableton's multiband dynamics. And the main thing to note is that if you drag this all the way up until it turns off, this basically disables the compression entirely. It's neutral. If we run a waveform through here, right, see, the white bars, the thin white bars represent the original amplitude, and then the solid green bar represents how much it's been compressed or expanded. So over here, the white bar exactly matches the green bar, so there's no compression happening. But if I drag this downward to compress the ratio more and more and more, you'll see that I'm pulling the green bar downward. And again, it only affects the part of the amplitude that it fits within the border of the green box, right? So once I get past the border of the green box, it's not really doing that much more, right? Okay, now the bottom one is a little different because you have this color changing depending on how much it's expanding or compressing the signal in upward manner. So by default, let's see, let's drag this in. Let's do it this way. Now you will focus on the center band. Oh no, that's post output. Let's take the voice down a bit. Let's take it down some more. Okay, so you'll notice as I drag the border higher than the original signal, it's starting to do upward compression. It's raising the signal above its natural point. Now, if I drag this downward to where it becomes neutral, right there, there's no change happening at all. And if I keep dragging downward, it turns light green, and now it's doing downward expansion. It's moving the signal even closer to the noise floor. So when it's light green, it's downward expansion. When it turns dark green, it's doing upward compression. So you have your up compression, and then over here, if we drag this down, for example, let's get it onto here, right? This one doesn't do upward expansion. It only does downward compression, like that, the top bar. Okay, so that's all we'll say about that. You can experiment with that and figure out more about that yourself. Last, we're on the last stretch here. Let's talk about the wavetable editor, because I'm not going to go deep on the wavetable editor. There's other videos that are already out there. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of great ones produced in the future, but let's talk about some basics, the high-level stuff that will confuse you at first. When you first open this up, especially if you start with basic shapes, you're going to get this weird editor that doesn't seem to work anything like you expect it to. Like as soon as you get near a point, things start snapping to it, right? And you get weird shapes that you can't predict, and you're just trying to draw a shape, right? You're just trying to do some sort of free drawing, but it's not working. It's snapping to these grid points. And what is this mode anyway, right? What you're really probably looking for to draw your own special shapes is something called, if we add a new wave source, we're going to add something called a line source. And a line source and let's remove this one. So a line source is what you kind of expect, which is I have a editor, kind of like an LFO editor, where I can, double click some shapes and snap them to points and set some curves, and now I can make a shape that's kind of a basic shape, but complex with harmonics and stuff, right? And you'll notice that when you're working in the line source mode, you can see what the resulting FFT bins look like and what the phase of those FFT bins are, but it's grayed out. You can't do anything down here. If I drag my mouse around down here, I can't do anything. So that brings us back to what is this other, we're going to remove this group. We're going to add in the basic wave source again, all right? So it starts out as a flat line, and this is our harmonic bins. This is the phase of each bin. And one thing you may not know at first is you can scroll wheel in and out to increase the resolution of these. So here's the first fundamental for a sine wave. And if we raise it up to about there, it's at its max amplitude, okay? So we've just taken the fundamental, raised it up a little bit, and this is additive style, FFT style wavetable editing, and that's the point of this wave source. It's meant to be an FFT editor. You're meant to just drag through here and get shapes, right? And then do things like right-click and clear out all the even harmonics. So now we have the fundamental, the third harmonic, the fifth harmonic, the seventh harmonic, and so on. And so that creates this kind of shape. And then down here, you mess with the phase. And if you start dragging around in here, you're messing with the phases of everything. You can always clear things out and get back to a starting point by right-clicking and clearing out all the FFTs, or right-clicking and clearing all the phases back down to neutral. And if for some reason you want to do a freeform thing, like let's get a sine wave up here again. Let's say I want to start with a sine wave and then draw some serum style jaggies into this. These snapping points will get you in trouble. So if you drag the grid down to 0, you can now come in here and just sort of hand draw little squiggles of noise. And you kind of have to click around at different spots near here to get the noise looking right. Okay, and you can come over here and put some more noise in. Click this way, click some notches in there, click some peaks out here. You can just click to jump to that point, right? And so now I've got some serum style noise, and you can see that reflected in what the full FFT series looks like all the way out to like way up in ultrasonic range. And here's all the phases out to ultrasonic range. So a couple tips for drawing jaggies, for working with the FFT editor. A tip for working with individual bins is zoom way in so you can grab one without accidentally grabbing another one like I just did, because there's no undo. That's unfortunate. Maybe at some point we'll get undo, but you can, if you're careful and work in the widest mode, you can be fairly surgical with a given bin. If you're zoomed out too much, it's way too easy to trip over into another bin. But sometimes that's exactly what you want, so that you can do things like, let's clear these out. Let's clear these out. Sometimes you want to draw little shapes, like you want to draw little weird curves like that to get interesting stuff. Okay, the next thing about the wavetable editor that's kind of interesting is if you start with something that looks like this, for example, and you add a line source. The line source is kind of multiplicative. It multiplies against the other sources in there. So here's the keyframe for this shape that we created as a wave source with bin drawing. And then here's the keyframe for a simple ramp up in the line source. Now, ramp up is neutral. It's completely neutral, but watch what happens when I, for example, take this and drag it to reshape this waveform. See how the gray colored wave source shape that we drew before is now warping to match this shape? And if I do something like put another point there and put another point here and drag this one down, see, I can completely warp that original shape into something different. And if we go look at it in the wavetable editor, it's now that original shape, but it's also being multiplied and reshaped by the line source on top of it. So that's an interesting trick to investigate, because you can get some nice nuanced things going on by letting one line source change the shape of other things, other types of sources. And then what else do we want to say here? I think that's about it. So thank you for hanging out with me. Hopefully you've learned a few things about Vital you didn't know, and those will help speed your workflow in sound design in the future. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.